have welcomed the move by the Department of Basic Education, compelling schools to report underage pregnancies. The department announced the policy change in an attempt to deal with statutory rape incidents that go unreported. However, unions have raised concerns of the capacity to follow through with the reports. Newzroom Afrika's Ramafsi filed this report.
A failure on the part of the community. Shocking statistics earlier this year revealed that over 23,000 pupils fell pregnant during last year's lockdown in Gauteng alone. Nearly 1,000 of them are between the ages of 10 and 14 years. But these numbers do not coincide with statutory rape cases reported to the police.
We realize that the police also need someone to report to them, and society, it seems, is not playing its part in that regard. Yet, year in, year out, we see statistics showing that there are high numbers of children, girl children, who fall pregnant, and there are cases of statutory rape which are not reported by anyone.
But the National Professional Teachers Organization of South Africa has raised concerns over police incapacity to follow through with the cases.
We are desperately concerned about capacity. We are desperately concerned about numbers. We've seen the stats of an ever-reducing number of policemen in the police force. And we know there are a lot of good people. However, if we don't have the numbers, we won't have the capacity to follow this up. Please ensure that we have the resources to do that, because it all revolves around that. There was a time when we had truant officers. Why not bring them back? And they were the people who assisted us as school heads, principals, teachers, to chase up kids that have just evaporated. We can no longer afford to have thousands of children dropping out of school for no good reason.
The new policy will see schools involve the police when a pregnant teen is below the age of 16 and the expectant father is older. However, when it comes to both expecting parents being below 16 years, families and social development will be called in for support. For Newzroom Africa on Channel 405, I am Ramashi in Johannesburg.
Right, back with you here on In Focus. Now, of course, that aspect of the policy is one but very important part of it. But there is a broader policy, national policy on the management and prevention of learner pregnancies. And here to talk to us about the implications of this new policy is Karabo, Ozah, Director at the Center for Child Law and Sexual Offences Researcher, Lisa Verton. Ladies, good evening, and thank you very much for your time and joining us here on In Focus. Of course, this has been the highlight in the media. One of the sections, measures to deal with sexual offences, child abuse and neglect, falling under the care, counselling and support part of this policy. But of course, it is a broader, all to a degree encompassing policy. You will tell me how far it goes. Talk to us about what are the policy goals, what are the guiding principles, and what is the scope of application here. Karabo, let's talk to you on this national policy for prevention and management of learner pregnancies.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I think we've been waiting for long for this, because you must remember there was a Constitutional Court judgment that said that DBE must adopt a policy to manage learner pregnancies, and that was in 2013. So the policy, as you mentioned, is broad. The drafts were much broader than what we ended up with. It aims to manage and actually provide support to pregnant learners. So that's a starting point of it. And it's important to also highlight that, because the main thing was that pregnant learners were being kicked out of school. And there needed to be a national policy as to how that should be addressed. But obviously then there were issues that relate to that, it was felt it's important that they also are incorporated, such as comprehensive sexuality education, which there are also other policies that clearly set out that. The issues of reporting where it's children, girls who are under the age of consent for sex, that's in there, but actually cross-refers to already existing policy, that's the management of sexual abuse and harassment protocol, which has already been existing. And I must also mention that we must remember that what is captured in the policy insofar as reporting it's something that's already in our laws. We already have the Children's Act, we already have the Sexual Offences Act, which have been law for over 10 years, putting obligations on schools, on teachers to report where there is an issue in relation to an abuse of children. Both legislation have provisions that actually specifically say certain professionals, particularly Section 110 of the Children's Act, professionals must actually report. So it's not something new. I think the policy tries to, in a way, consolidate and just remind everybody that when you're dealing with a pregnant learner, if they are of this age, it is an offense. It may be an offense, well, they are under 12s, can never consent, so it's an offense. Yeah. So you must have an approach that directly tells you to go to report it. But we've already had those provisions existing in our law, and I think one of the clips you played said that the problem is implementation. Right. And I think we're going to still sit with that same problem right now.
Critical partnerships, I suppose, pointing to that aspect of things in this particular policy. But Lisa, come in, let's talk about what Karabo is raising. I mean, at the heart of it is the access to education for a pregnant learner, and it speaks of reasonable accommodation. What's your understanding of what that means? It says the school and its principal and staff will take all reasonable steps to accommodate the learner's learning, health and maternal needs.
Well, I think one of the first things that they should obviously make very clear is that there ought to be no stigma and no discrimination of pregnant learners. So there should be a great deal of attention paid to making sure that classmates, other learners, are not in any way turning the pregnant learner into a joke or making it hard for her to come to school. Nor should they be making her sit in a classroom all by herself where nobody can see her to make her feel incredibly ashamed of herself, because we are really talking about girls here. So I think there's obviously a balance here around there's a need to do this in a way that is not stigmatizing, that is not discriminatory. I mean, I think the questions where educators tend to get quite uncomfortable is when girls come back to school, is what kind of accommodation should they make for them to perhaps bring their babies to school. And often there is a great deal of resistance to that, especially if a young woman is still, say, breastfeeding or something like that. Quite often you find educators don't want babies to be brought to school. I mean, there are a range of reasons, I suppose, why that would be disruptive. But they have to also think about things like, if the baby's still very small, how do you accommodate breastfeeding, etc. If you're going to write exams and you're very close to your birth date, how does that get accommodated? So I think there's a range of different things that need to be thought about in ways that make it clear that this is not stigmatizing, you're not stigmatizing and you're not discriminating against somebody, and you're giving them support and you're doing your best to ensure that they stay in school and complete their educations, because there's no reason why a teen pregnancy should become, your lifelong ticket to poverty, because nobody will let you back into school to complete your education so that you can get on with your life. So I think we've got to take as many steps as possible to make sure that it's having a baby. It's not the end of the world. Most of it in the world have babies. You can be able to get on with your life, fulfill your dreams and those of your child as well. So I think there still probably may need to be quite a bit of thought around how you do that kind of reasonable accommodation in a range of different ways, bearing in mind that not all schools have the same resources.
Yeah. And as far as prevention is concerned, I mean, a critical partner here, law enforcement coming in, saying in a sense a school may be compelled in a way to report, especially in a case where an older male learner impregnates a younger, below the age, a female learner. Is this a good partnership and an implementable one, Lisa?
To go back to Karabo's point, this has been the law since 2007 at least in relation to the Sexual Offences Act. So it's really quite concerning that here we are, 13, 14 years later, and those kinds of partnerships have not been put into place yet. There's already a problem that even where you don't have learners who are falling pregnant, where teachers discover that sexual abuse is going on, even then they're still not reporting. So I think the really important thing is for us to go and ask the question, this has been in place, what is stopping you from implementing? Why are you not able to implement? Do you have the necessary relationships with your local district office of the Department of Social Development or designated child protection agency? Do you know who to call? Do you know who are your closest police officers? None of those things seems to have been set in place. And I think there's also, because the other step in the Sexual Offences Act or the Children's Act is that those who don't report should be prosecuted. So in theory, if they were implementing this, they'd also be taking that step. And I think that may also be putting people off from reporting. But I think the question they need to start with is, we've had this legislation, why have we not been implementing? And until they can answer that question, it's all very well us putting into place new policy that's actually not so new, that looks new simply because nobody's been implementing it. So I think that's the question they need to ask themselves is, why have you not been doing this? What's been getting in the way?
Guiding principles of the national policy on the prevention and management of learner pregnancies under discussion tonight here on In Focus. Weigh in on it on 072-110-5584. Otherwise, you can tweet us at Newzroom 405. Karabo, Ozah and Lisa Verton continuing with us next. Back live tonight here on In Focus, Newzroom Africa, channel 405, the national policy on the management and the prevention of learner pregnancies under discussion tonight with Karabo, Ozah, as well as Lisa Verton. Karabo, Lisa talks about the question of discrimination and stigmatization. Is the clarity on the roles and responsibilities of the different players in ensuring the prevention of discrimination?
Yeah, so the policy does say that the school principal must lead, but there should be a designated teacher who kind of assists learners who fall pregnant and guides them through the process. And in that way also tries to say that their privacy should be respected. I mean, addressing the stigma and discrimination is a school-wide thing that should be something that the school, addresses all the learners about and tries to also sensitize them that a pregnant learner, as we've seen the stats, most of them might be victims of sexual offenses. So you must sensitize the whole school and the other learners, as well as parents, about why is it that we have this policy, because we live in a country where we have such high rates of sexual violence, and we shouldn't be oblivious and say, oh, this one is pregnant. They gallivanting, as we know, the stigmas go around in relation to pregnant learners. So there are those that are really set out. As I said, there's also cross-reference to comprehensive sexuality education, which the department has a different policy on, which is supposed to be sensitizing and teaching learners about responsibility, access to contraceptives and where to get all those guidance. Tabo, I just want to quickly mention something very important. We must remember that the criminal process is not the only route that needs to be taken here, because in the criminal process, the reporting and everything, the burden of proof is a higher one, and we know we are terrible, and Lisa can attest to this when it comes to convicting sexual violence. But at the same time, we also have SACE and the education stakeholders not being responsible and taking the cases in relation to disciplinary processes where it's teachers who perpetrated sexual offenses against learners. So apart from whether the learner goes to criminal process, the teacher must go through a disciplinary process, and we know that there are problems there where they will say, well, we have 1,000 cases reported, but we've only dealt with 300 or only 300 convictions, and teachers are moving around, and all those things. Those are also some of the things that need to be addressed, because particularly when it comes to educators as well as support staff, we're seeing a lot of cases of gardeners who work at schools raping learners, and the schools and the school governing bodies watching to wash their hands of it. We actually have cases that are going to court in relation to SGB responsibilities on that it shouldn't just be that it's about the criminal process. So where that is taking long, which is always, we know it does, and it might not actually end up with a positive outcome, there should be a place where SACE does those cases, and actually if people are found guilty, they should be found unsuitable to work with children and should not be teachers anymore. And that's very, very important to remember. And this policy kind of cross-refers to the protocol on sexual harassment and sexual abuse, which has more detail about how that should take place.
Yeah. Now, I don't know whether this is something that looks good on paper or it's something that really they are serious about putting in place. It says one of the responsibilities here, the Department of Basic Education is one of several role players responsible for the psychological and material support of pregnant learners. That in itself speaks to the fact that there needs to be a coordination from inside education, but also outside of the education department with, for example, the Department of Health, with the Department of Social Development, and that needs to be tightly well coordinated. We don't really have evidence of this happening in the past. I don't know if we can be certain that it will happen in the future. Lisa?
Yes, I think that's incredibly important. And in fact, I think there's a real argument to be made for schools to once again have their own social workers. That used to be the norm a number of years ago, but it was unfortunately taken away. So I really think there's a strong argument for the Department of Basic Education to be reconsidering that particular decision. Because, one of the difficulties you face with departments is that they have different goals, different objectives, and different performance targets. So unless you make addressing teenage pregnancy in schools the responsibility or performance target for the Department of Social Development or the Department of Health, they're not going to prioritize that if they have other priorities first. So I think you've got to develop performance plans for departments that make sure they're coordinating those particular policies together. Plus, you also have to look at things like how does the Department of Health's own policies on things like, say, adolescent-friendly clinics, how do those link to schools? What kind of links can be made, can be drawn more closely? Because I think a lot of the problems that young people face has got a lot to do with their access to contraception at the local clinic. And often those clinics are extremely unfriendly. If you're talking about a small town, some of those nurses are going to know that particular young woman's mother. And she's not going to want to go there in case her mother hears from the nurse, oh, guess who I saw at the clinic today. So there's a real need to think about how do we make clinics adolescent friendly? How do we perhaps link them directly to schools? What are the different kinds of novel and innovative ways we can think to start making these different departments join up and start working together? And as I've said, unless they start sitting down and planning together, it's going to be a case of, oh, that's DBE's policy. We don't have to report on it. We don't have to do anything about it. So it's DBE's baby. So I think there's got to be a move towards pushing departments together to start developing integrated plans and reporting in an integrated way to Parliament. So, the Portfolio Committee on Basic Education, when they're listening to this policy, they shouldn't just be hearing from basic education. They should be calling both health, social development, and SAPS, for instance, to say, tell us how you've worked together and you report to us as well. And in that way, they make the responsibility more than basic education. But, if you look at how we work at the moment in terms of accountability, we're still quite a long way away from that kind of integrated reporting and accountability, unfortunately.
Yeah. Karabo, scientifically accurate information on sexual and reproductive health rights is what they are calling for. Is there such a thing? Does it exist somewhere that would ensure that when given to teenagers, it would delay their sexual debut?
So I think, having been in that space of sexual reproductive health rights, the terminology is meant to ensure that there isn't misleading information that's been given. So if you read, I've been to other countries on the continent where the policies, for instance, would say that homosexuality, something bad about it, which is not scientifically correct. So firstly, it needs to align with obviously our international law and our domestic law, but that information should not be misleading, should not be false information. It should not be things that some people make up. There are countries where school policies on pregnancies are meant to scare learners, and they write things in the or even in their comprehensive sexuality education, even though they don't like the terminology, they write things in there that actually would create problems for the young people, for the adolescents, and not educate them in a way that is scientifically correct, that can help them to make decisions about sexual debut, or if they do have sex, to actually make informed decisions about contraceptives and issues like that. So that is how I can explain it. I don't know whether Lisa has a better understanding of it.
Yeah, what do they mean, Lisa?
I think the challenge we face in South Africa, and we saw this coming up about 2 years ago, is there's a great deal of resistance from many parents and many communities in South Africa to providing sexuality education in school. I think a great many parents feel that school's overstepping their boundaries, that the parents should be taking charge of that. And they also don't want their children, I think, to learn too much. I think there was all that debate around masturbation and condoms and the like in schools. So I think the tension here is really around what's going to be the balance in schools and what's going to be the balance with parents, because there are parents who are very hostile to their children being taught about sex in schools. And I think that's really where the difficulties lie, is what you're trying to teach at school, what parents will accept, what churches say, and then the very contradictory and confusing messages that young people get about what they should and shouldn't do, and which keeps them quiet. so that when they do get into difficulties or don't know what to do, they don't have anyone to talk to because they're just surrounded by judgment and false information on every side. So I think it's something you can put into policy, but at the day-to-day level, it becomes a source of conflict, I think, within communities and particularly between parents and schools. So this is an area where we're going to need a lot more debate because it won't clearly be solved by policy.
Ladies, I appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us, Karabo, Ozah and Lisa Verton there, helping us in that conversation tonight. When we